Okay, welcome everyone to Nishmat's Faith in a World of Turmoil series. We are very privileged to have all of you with us, and we're privileged to hear from Rav Yehoshua Weisberg, who is the head of Nishmat's Shana Ba'aretz 18-year-old gap year international program. He is the founding head of the program and has been running it ever since. Rav Weisberg grew up in Canada and attended Wesleyan University and does all sorts of interesting endeavors. Currently, he is completing his first book on Masachet Avodah Zarah. And in addition to being the program head at Nishmat and a full-time Rebbe here, he is also a chef and has a hospitality business for tourists out of his home in Jerusalem, where he lives with his wife and 8 children. So with no further ado, Rev Weisberg, take it away.
Hi there. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me okay, Julie?
Yeah.
Great. So I can't see everybody. Everyone's on non-video, at least according to mine. That's okay if you want your privacy, but it's easier for me to teach if I can see everybody, or at least some of you. Oh, there we go. Thank you, Nicola. Anybody else brave enough to, oh, thank you, Paula, Lindsay. Julie, people should be able to interrupt, hello, Eliana, anytime if they want to say anything or ask a question. You're the host. Can you set it up so that people can unmute themselves and go back in?
It should be that everyone can unmute themselves whenever they want.
Right.
If
Yes,
not,
we can.
Hi, Wendy. Nice to see you. Okay, so I'm going to get started. And anyway, it's nice to meet you all. Some of you, obviously, I know. Some of you either were former students or have daughters who are former students of mine, so it's especially nice to see you. So I'll just say a little bit, thank you, Julie, for the introduction. Related a little bit to this class is that in addition to being a full-time Rebbe at Nishmat and father of 8 kids, at the moment that means I'm homeschooling 8 kids. But in addition to that, I'm also a chef and work in a restaurant downtown and run a business out of my house where groups from all around the world come and get a big fancy meal and then a talk about Judaism that's relevant to them. So I've done a lot of different groups over the years. I just recently had a group of Catholic priests and monks and gave them a talk about Jewish messianism, which was clearly intriguing for them. Not just the conclusions, but just the way that we think about things is so different from what they're used to. I had a group of Mennonites, and we spoke about modernity and confronting modernity. So just about anyone you can imagine, Jewish, not Jewish. And this summer, I was asked to do a bit of a speaking tour, be it scholar in residence at a few shuls, and I was going to I was asked to give the sermon at a mega church in Florida, in Sarasota, give one of those really big ones with, the pastor's a friend of mine. He came to our house for Shabbat once, and he wanted me to give a big talk with the smoke machine and the rock band and the whole bit. And when that didn't happen, because of Corona, it's unlikely to happen. So he and a few of the shuls that I'm working with asked me to give a series of talks that would sort of introduce them to the Talmudic way of thinking about things, in particular the question of crisis and faith. Everyone's dealing with those questions now. And so I developed a bit of a series, and I've been running it for different shuls. So when Julie asked me to speak, it was perfect. It was set up right for the topic. So what we're going to talk about, I'll just say one more thing. So when I teach groups, it's actually not so different from teaching at Nishmat. The challenge is the Talmud was closed as a text about 1,500 years ago. And the Talmud, as you probably know, includes conversations that go back far, far before that, at least 700 years. And the overwhelming challenge of the Talmud is not only managing the Aramaic and the Hebrew, but is taking a spiritual and ethical language that was very real and meaning and authentic 2,000 years ago, 1,500, 2,000 years ago, and making it, bridging that language, translating it into our world, and seeing the power and the value of it. So that's what I'm going to try to do today with you. I've sent Julie in a second. Julie, I'll ask you to put it up. I asked Julie, oh, hi, Harriet, good to see you. I asked Julie to share screen a series of sources. I'll do the sources all in English, but I've put the original Aramaic and Hebrew because I know that some of you appreciate that. we're going to go through today the sources in English, and if in the future you'd like to have a class, I'm happy to do it all in Hebrew, Aramaic, or whatever you like. We're going to focus on a few stories. I'll give a bit of an introduction from Masechet Ta'anit. Ta'anit is a tractate in the Talmud, but actually the topic of Masechet Ta'anit is maintaining faith and responding to times of turmoil. In the context of the Talmud and the Mishnah that preceded it, again, we're talking about anywhere between 2,000 and 1,500 years ago. Turmoil that we're experiencing in the times of the coronavirus could have been anything. It could have been a drought, it could have been a famine, it could have been a plague, could have been a flu that they did not identify. And the Talmud tries to figure out what's the appropriate response to grand, things happening badly. I mean, things that happen that are terrible on a scale that's not private. It's not a personal catastrophe, but a national or a communal one. Now, obviously, Masechet Ta'anit, being a religious text, deals with spiritual responses. But it's interesting that it doesn't just deal with that. It deals a lot with policy, questions of policy, and managing a community through times of crisis. So there's both the emphasis on faith and also on policy. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how those two work together. Just I want to say, it's interesting. I taught Ta'anit at Nishmat a few years ago, and a student came to me. I teach Israelis and also the overseas students. And one of the Israelis had just finished her Shrut Leumi, right? National service, everyone's familiar. A 19-year-old woman, young woman, finishes high school and goes out into the world and serves her country either in the military or if she chooses in a national service. And this young woman who was in my class was a very religious girl, but she had spent 2 years on the pediatric oncology ward of an Israeli hospital. She came to me after class and said, listen, I spent 2 years, teaching and working with children, many of whom died over the course of the time that I was there. I look very religious, but my faith is, shattered. And I need to rebuild that. That's why I'm coming to Nishmat. And her project over the year was to learn Masechet Ta'anit with me, just because the way that we approach God honestly, in a world that often seems like it seems to be falling apart, is such a deep part of living a life of faith. So that's something the Masechet Ta'anit deals with. We're not going to focus on that particular aspect today. We're going to focus on a different aspect. But just give you a sense, give you a promo from Masechet Ta'anit if anyone wants to learn it. It's a powerful, beautiful, and I think a life-changing experience to learn it. So what we're going to look at today in Masechet Ta'anit are three characters that the Gemara presents, primarily in the third chapter of the Masechet. And each of the three characters responds to times of crisis in a very different way, sort of a three-pronged approach. And what I'm interested in particular, looking at each one of those three, but also looking at how the Talmud embraces all three, as if to say that there is more than one way. Not only is there more than one way, but a healthy community needs to approach crisis on many different levels at once. And that's a question that I find incredibly important today. Like everybody probably, I follow the news, and the way that the Israeli leadership and the American or the Canadian leadership are dealing with the crisis. I sort of follow the policy decisions. I wonder about them. Someone has a small business, I'm very concerned about the economy and how it's working and making a living, and concerned about the larger policy decisions. But the Talmud says that there's also a spiritual level in which a community or a nation responds to crisis, and that's extremely important. And there's also a private way that we respond to crisis. So I'm going to try to show you three characters who exemplify each of those three. Okay, we're good? So at any point, if you want to ask a question or interrupt or just tell me that I'm wrong and have something else to insert, you're welcome to do that. If you start taking over the discussion, Julie will just mute you so everything's fine. All right, so, but if you have any questions or anything, just let me know. Okay, so we're going to look at three stories. In a second, Julie, I'll ask you to put them up. The first story, or the first set of stories, is from the third paragraph, Kaf Amud Bet, 20b. And the context here is important. The context of the story, two stories that we're going to see, is the question of shaky walls, of walls that are built in a city or buildings that are built in a city, and they fall down, and it causes death and damage to the community. And the community starts to wonder whether it's some sort of a wake-up call, whether something went wrong on a spiritual, ethical, communal level, and that's why this bad thing happened. It's a very natural instinct that we have. And the Mishnah, the original Talmudic source behind the Talmud, says, listen, there are different types of things. Not everything that happens is a wake-up call from God. Sometimes if a wall falls down, I don't want you to pray. You should be calling an engineer and designing better walls in the future. If a building collapses, it's not God's fault. Don't ask him why it happened. Check your building plans and make sure you did a good job. But it says there are times when there are exceptional events happen. Events happen out of the ordinary. Something went wrong on a deeper level than just you didn't plan well enough. There's something deeper going on, something ethical or spiritual going on. And when things really happen out of the blue, it's worth asking those questions. And so the Talmud goes on and tells a series of stories about different rabbis who respond to different cases of shaky walls or otherwise walls falling down. And I chose one rabbi with two stories. The rabbi's name is Rav Huna. He is a Babylonian scholar. Not only is he a scholar, but he's the head of he's called the Exilarch. He's the Resh Galuta. He's the head of the Jewish community in Babylon. He's a very wealthy man, extremely. A tremendous scholar and a very righteous man. And the following two stories are the first story is about how he responds to falling walls, and the second story is about his approach economically in general. Okay, so Julie, you want to put the sources up? It's source number 1 and 2. We'll start with 1. You got it? Okay, great. Okay, so we're going to look, if you want to scroll down a little bit, Julie, just put the 1 up at the top so you can see 1 and 2. Okay, so these are two stories from the Talmud. I want to look at them, slowly. So as I said, Rav Huna is the Exilarch. He's the head of the Jewish community. He represents the Jewish community to the Persian king, to the regional powers. And in Babylon and Iraq, it doesn't rain very often. The average rainfall is very minimal. But when it rains, it can really storm. Okay? So this is what the Talmud says. It says, on a very cloudy day, or on every cloudy day, Rav Huna would go out in his golden carriage. He was carried by a group of servants who would carry him on a golden carriage. And he would survey the city. And he would command that every unstable wall be torn down. So knowing that the rain undermines the foundations of structures because it shifts the earth and the land, something that unfortunately in Jerusalem I'm all too aware of. I don't want to say much about the quality of roads in Jerusalem, but those of you who've been here recently know that the rain this winter turned over a lot of roads, including my own in front of my house. And he knows that the rain can be very destructive to undermining foundations. And he said, I go through the city, and every time he sees a wall that looks shaky, he would have it torn down. So if the owner was able to build the wall, financially set up, then Rav Huna would instruct him, you have to build the wall. I mean, it's your responsibility. It's your wall. You didn't take care of it. It's unstable. I knocked it down as a public, service, taking care of the public. You have to build it down. But if you're unable to, if he was a poor man, then Rav Huna would pay for the rebuilding himself. He would send his own workers. Okay, very simple story. Now, the story is striking in the context of the Talmud. And please, anytime you have a question, just jump in. Rav Huna is interesting in this context because other rabbis respond in all sorts of mystical ways. There are rabbis who have such tremendous charisma that influences angels and the walls don't fall on them. And there's all sorts of series of sort of magical or spiritual responses to a world that's falling apart. And in that context of sort of magical rabbis, Rav Huna is, for me at least, a breath of fresh air. He says, listen, I'm not interested in that so much. I got to do what I can do. And if it looks like something's coming, if it looks like there's a pandemic coming, if it looks like, there's a war coming, then I'm going to do my very best to prepare the civil society to make sure we have what we need and to take care of things. It's very much a policy approach to things. If he realizes that individuals can't afford to take care of what he's instituting as his policy, he doesn't change the policy for them. He doesn't have mercy on people and say, oh, you can't afford it, so I won't take down your wall, because his primary responsibility is to the public. But behind the scenes, as a wealthy individual, he makes sure that every individual person gets the care that they need in terms of being able to support. And there's sort of a double-pronged approach that I find just captivating. And I look to national leadership, I personally look for something like that, a relatively strict, demanding approach to the individual, that you fall in line and you take care of the public good, but at the same time, a lot of compassion for the individuals. Okay? So that's Rav Huna on walls. I want to go on to the second story. Okay, can you go down a little bit? This is also a wonderful story. Rav Huna had an interest in how the markets of his town would work. Okay, so this is a great story. He said every Friday afternoon before Shabbat, Rav Huna would send a messenger to the marketplace, right? Like Machane Yehuda, a big market, people are buying before Shabbat. And he would purchase all the vegetables personally of his own money that were left over with the gardeners who sold their crops, meaning all the farmers came in. And he would put them on a raft and send them down the river. Now, he didn't need the food, obviously. He's a very wealthy man. He purchased this stuff earlier. So he put all the extra food on a raft and sent it down the river. I'm bringing in Rashi, who gives that interpretation. So the Gemara says, the Talmud says, well, why didn't he just give it all to the poor? Meaning, if he buys the food, why didn't he give it to the poor? And the Talmud says, if he gave the food to the poor, they would rely on the fact that he was handing out vegetables, and they wouldn't come to purchase anything, and they would ruin the gardener's livelihood. Okay, everyone get the image, right? If I give out handouts, then I'm creating a handout society. That's going to undermine the market. Any businessman is going to have to either adjust to deal with a handout society, and I'm going to perpetuate the problem and hurt the ability of people with initiative to make money. And that's not an approach I want. So then if you can go down a little bit, Julie. But the Gemara says, well, wait a second, then why, if you don't want to hurt, then why did he purchase them at all? And the Gemara says, well, if nothing was done, he would have caused a stumbling block on the other side, because if the vegetable sellers saw that some of their produce was left unsold, and the next week they would bring less, and people wouldn't have enough for Shabbat, and the prices would go up. So Rav Huna made sure that vegetables were all brought so that the sellers would continue to bring them. Okay, everyone catches right, to apply this to today's free market is actually, I don't know the technical details, but conceptually, it's not a difficult model to understand, right? His model is, I need to protect the market. I need to protect the ability for people to do business. I want people to be able to make a living, to be independent, not to lean on charity. At the same time, if I let the market run its course entirely, then there are a lot of people going to be left behind. But rather than change the rules of the market, he says, I'll personally intervene by buying up extra produce to making sure the market functions and making sure that the poor are taken care of. But intervention, even when it's well-intentioned, can destroy the ultimate thing that you're trying to protect, which is people's livelihood and the proper flow of goods. Okay, everybody get the picture? There's a combination of sort of proper, reasonable, thoughtful, well-planned policy with a lot of chesed in it. But the chesed doesn't interfere with the policy issues, okay? So that's part of a series of stories and legal discussions in Masechet Ta'anit. They're about how do you guide a community as a policy leader through times of crisis. Okay, good. Any questions so far? We're good? Okay, great. So do you mind going up a little bit, Julie? Oh, no, sorry, scroll down a minute, sorry. To the next story. Okay, that's it, 3, that's good. Okay, so Masechet Ta'anit, the literal term Ta'anit is a reference to days of prayer and to days of fasting. Ta'anit, obviously, like Ta'anit Esther or like Yom Kippur, which is a Yom Ta'anit, the days of fasting. And that is where most of the halachic questions are about. How do you go about showing repentance, sincerity and honesty and contrition before God when you feel that something's happened that's gone wrong in the world and you think that somehow you're responsible for that, that the behavior of the community has gone poorly, and we need to sort of show Hashem that we're really want to be on top of things and we really want to get it right. And so we do a Ta'anit like Yom Kippur. We do different Ta'aniot throughout the year. And most of the Ta'aniot in Masechet Ta'anit are related to drought, to when there's no rain. So this story is an exceptional story. There are many, many stories to choose from in the Masechet. This story, though, is a particular one. It's a very famous one. I'm sure most of you have seen it or heard of it at different times in your life. But I want to point out something really interesting about it. The historical context is important in this case. Choni is not someone we know from external historical documents, but the way that the Talmud describes him, we can actually place him historically, plus or minus the year 70, 75 BCE, okay, BC, before the Common Era. And that's an important date. And I'm going to explain a little bit about the context of Choni, and then we'll look at the story together. Okay, we're good? Choni is associated with the reign of Shlom Tzion, the Queen Shlom Tzion. Now, Queen Shlom Tzion is a fascinating case. She's only one of only two women who were the sovereign of Judah in all of our history. I'm not including Golden Meir. I'm saying in the ancient times there were two sovereigns, queens, who ran the country, in particular Judah. And she's the only good one. The other one was not quite it was a bit of a piece of work. The other one, Italia, she killed a lot of people. And Shlom Tzion was she's an outstanding leader. She had her husband, Yehoshua Alexander, was a third generation Hasmonean. And he ran the country with a very strong hand. And when he died, his wife took over. The two sons that she had both later became king in order. A very problematic civil war, actually, between them. But in the period between her husband dying and her children being old enough that she felt she was able to give over the reins of the nation to them, she took over and she reigned until she died, about 10 years period. And Josephus, the historian, writes that Shlom Tzion was actually an extremely clever leader. And in particular, interestingly enough, she had a very successful foreign policy. She made several trips to Rome and worked very closely with the Romans. And she had an outstanding military policy. She ran the decisions of the army. And she handed over the domestic rule, the religious policy, the legal policy of the country to her brother, whose name was Shimon ben Shetach, and he was the head of the Sanhedrin. You don't have to remember the name so much, but Shimon ben Shetach, talking about 75 BCE, ran the country also very firm hand. And he was a Rav Huna type in that he believed that it's policy that matters. It's policy that matters. If the country is functioning well, if the government is functioning well, if the economy is functioning well, if the safety net, social safety net is functioning well, then things will be good and God will respond and take care of us. It's a very biblical approach to Jewish life. You know, if we're good, if we behave, keep the mitzvot, run society well, have good people, take care of the poor, give loans, keep Shemitah, keep Shabbat, and everything will go well. And when things don't go well, Shimon ben Shetach's response was not to have sort of a personal mercy on individuals, even though I'm sure he cared, but was to try to get people to get their act together. There's no point in handing out handouts. People need to lift themselves up and get things together. So that's the time in which Choni, who's sort of an outlier in society, we don't hear much about him otherwise, things don't work. All of a sudden, there's a tremendous drought. Some sources, ancient sources, talk about it being a 3-year drought, which you can imagine Israel would have been catastrophic. And the people feel that God has left them, no longer cares about them, is not willing. Shimon Shetach is furious because people he believes are letting God down. It's not God letting us down. We're just not behaving well. But the people feel God has left them. And they turn to Choni and they ask him to pray for them for rain. Okay, now this is a story you've probably seen before. I've shortened it a bit because it's a story one can spend hours on. It's extremely rich from a literary perspective. But I wanted just to look at the heart of the story and to see where Choni comes from. And I want to contrast him, of course, to Rav Huna and Shimon Shetach. Rav Huna, whom we saw before, who had the golden carriage, and Shimon Shetach, who's the ruler of the country together with his sister, the Queen Shlom Tzion. So once most of the month of Adar, right, we're getting into the spring, late spring had passed, and the rain had not yet fallen. There'd been a winter without any rain. It's a disaster in the ancient world. You know, your water cisterns are empty, your fields are all dried up. You might die of thirst, you might die of starvation. It's just a catastrophe, nothing like what we experience today in times of drought. It's really a life-threatening disaster. And they sent a message to Choni, who was called Hama'agel, which means a circle drawer. And they said to him, pray and rain will fall. And he prayed, but no rain fell. So he tried the usual approach. So then he drew a circle in the dust. This is the very famous story. I'm sure many of you heard it in kindergarten. And he stood inside it, and I skipped a few lines, and he said, Master of the universe, your children have turned their faces to me. Because I'm as if I'm a Ben Bait, I'm one of your household. So I'm taking an oath by your name that I won't move from the circle until you have mercy upon your children and you answer their prayers for rain. So the rain began to trickle down in small droplets. So all of a sudden there's this huge change, but it only starts to rain a little bit. And I took out some pieces so it wouldn't be too long, but the people then complained. They said, that's not going to help. You know, Choni, that's nice that it's drizzling, but you know, we're starving and we're dying of thirst. That's not going to help us. So Choni says to God, I didn't ask for this kind of rain. He said, but for rain to fill the cisterns and the ditches and the caves. And then the rain began to fall furiously until every drop was as big as the mouth of a pot or a barrel. Huge, tremendous rain, very destructive rain. And again, the people say to Choni, listen, that's too much, it's going to kill us, it's going to destroy our homes and our fields, and everything that has grown is going to be ruined. And Choni once again said before God, I did not ask for the harmful rain either. I asked for a rain of benevolence and blessing and generosity, and the rain came. Okay, so that's Choni. Now that's a miracle story that goes way, way back. We're talking about 2,100 years in Jewish history. It has the earliest record of that story is actually very, very early. The earliest record is about 100 years after the story, which is very early in Jewish in terms of our own record. So it's clearly an ancient story. Now what happened, technically, I can't tell you. But Jewish tradition sees Choni as sort of the greatest of all people who learned how to pray to God. And what I would like to, here we go. And what I'd like to point out is the language that Choni uses. He says, listen, you can be harsh on your people, and you can punish them like Shimon ben Shetach wants. But at the end of the day, we're helpless before you. We're like little children before a father. And we need your help. There's a recognition that as much as we try, and we do try, as much as we take responsibility, and we do take responsibility, we need you to help us, Hashem. There's a sense of humility and smallness and vulnerability, and turning to God like a father, when a kid is in need, that is so powerful and strikes underneath all of our taking care of the world around us. There's a vulnerability and there's a recognition that we need God's help. And Choni hits that tone better than anybody. Now, why is a larger question in the tractate. But Choni somehow knows the relationship, the deeper underlying relationship with God that we have, the one of love and caring, that can be hidden often in times of disaster. Often when things are going badly, people are losing their jobs, people are dying. It's easy to feel that God's turned his back. And Choni turns to God and says, I know you love the people. I know that you care about them. And I know this is part of something you're doing, and it's part of a plan. But we need you to be merciful. We need you to love us. We need to help us. And that ability to hit that tone apparently is part of what it takes as the Jewish people to survive. Okay? So if you look at the breadth of Jewish history, it's not only the brilliant policy making of, let's say, Rav Huna or Shimon ben Shetach, right? You also need that tone of, God, we just need you. It's not in our hands, meaning we'll do what we can, but we need your guidance, we need your help. And it's because we're your children that we're turning to you. That's Choni. All right, so far so good? So no one said anything, so I'm assuming everything's fine. So if you can go down, Julie. So here's the thing. Shimon ben Shetach, if you remember, he's like the interior, he's like the secretary, not secretary of state, I forget in America how it goes, but he's the secretary of health, he's the secretary of education, he's the secretary of the interior, Misrad HaPnim, Misrad HaDatot, Misrad HaChinuch, he's all those things. Shimon ben Shetach, Chazal say, was the first person in Jewish history to institute obligatory day school. He was the first person to make it obligatory. Everybody should learn literacy. Everyone had to learn to read and write. And he made that a fundamental policy, and apparently he was also paid for in that. So he was someone who changed systems. He completely reorganized the legal system in all of Israel. God made a lot of enemies that way. As anyone who's following Israeli politics knows, that playing with the justice system can get you in a lot of trouble. But he did that. He was very bold. Now, obviously, Shimon ben Shetach, when he looks at Choni, who's begging God for mercy, that drives Shimon ben Shetach out of his mind, right? Because Shimon ben Shetach is like, listen, it doesn't work like that. And if it does work like that, it shouldn't work like that, because that's not doing you any favors by giving you the rain. It's not a favor. The only favor God can do for you is to hold back the rain, to withhold the rain, so that you learn how to get your act together, right? It's like a parent, and I can tell there's more than a few parents in the group. It's like a parent. The best thing in so many times, all of us know that, is to show discipline to your child and put up boundaries. What kind of child grows up without boundaries? You need to put a boundary, say, no, you can't have that, no, you want that, or no, you misbehaved, there's going to be consequences, it's punishment for that, and to be firm about it. You often feel as a parent sort of, it's hard to do it on the one hand, but there's a deep sense of satisfaction knowing you're doing the right thing for your kid. I have 8 kids, so I have a few different types. And even the really rebellious kids, I noticed that when you're firm with them, they feel relaxed because they even though they fight you, they relax because they know that there's order in the world and they're part of that. Shimon Shetach says, listen, even if that comes at a tremendous cost, there's no point in mercy and God giving you freebies, because then what's the point? Then you just learn that it's okay to be bad. So he hits the roof when Choni does this, okay? And the Talmud goes on and on about this. I'm just bringing you a short scene. Shimon ben Shetach, and you've got to imagine this, people are starving to death, right? Something that none of us could stand by if we could do something. And Choni steps into a circle and argues with God in front of the people. And God responds, and Choni says, listen, these are your children, they're your children, they're your children. There's a limit to how much you can discipline them. I'm sorry, he said, you've got to love them. And they don't see it, they don't feel it. They don't see the discipline as loving, they see it as abandonment. So Choni sort of begs with God to change the mechanisms of love and relationship. And God gives him what he wants. So Shimon ben Shetach, who represents the policy maker, the president, the prime minister, the person who's trying to take care of things, he sends a message to Choni saying, listen, if you weren't you're a special guy and I can't touch you. But if it wasn't you, I would have excommunicated you for that. That's amazing. Here's a guy who saved the Jewish people. We have in the Second Temple period, there was a yearly celebration. It was Choni Day. The people used to literally celebrate in memory of this story in Second Temple period. We have a record of the ancient list of special festive days, and one of them is Choni's Day. And he says, you nag God. It's like, you're such a pain in the neck. You're bothering God all the time. And he does what you do, what you say, which is even crazier. It's like a kid. He says, you ever walk in the park and you see a kid who tells his father, he says, listen, I want to go to a hot water. I want to have a cold water. I want some nuts. I want some almonds, peaches, pomegranates. You can imagine that, today would be ice cream and cotton candy and whatever else. You've all seen that kid, whether it was your own kid, whether someone else's kid, at a fair, at a festival, and you see the parent constantly giving in to what the kid demands. And you roll your eyes and say, that's going to ruin the kid. You're not doing anyone any favors. So that's Shimon ben Shetach. And as the Talmud continues, it says that Shimon Shetach wasn't the only person who expressed himself in the context. The other rabbis of the time didn't agree with Shimon ben Shetach. And it's a very sweet story that they're afraid of him because he's a very tough guy. So they went around his back and sent a message to Choni saying, good job, Choni, we love what you do. Just don't tell Shimon ben Shetach we told you that. But what I love about the dynamic is that the Talmud recognizes you absolutely need a Shimon ben Shetach and a Rav Huna in the picture. You need someone whose priority is the overall health of the system, the consistent long-term functioning of the policy. And if that comes at the expense of individuals, that comes even at great pain, that's what you need to do. Sometimes you need to tell the people, it's blood, sweat, and tears time. We're not going to survive this unless we all sacrifice. Don't ask what your country can do for you. It's time to ask what you can do, what you can sacrifice. Get your act together. And sometimes a leader has to be tough and not tell people the thing that they want to hear. At the same time, the Talmud realizes that there's nothing if you don't have a Choni. Because when times are hard, they're hard. They're hard. And you need someone who reminds you that God's there, that shows you that God's there, that brings your attention to all the small miracles and the chesed that surrounds your life. Because it's so easy to despair when people are dying, when there's ambulances running through the streets, when the numbers of deaths in the city are just staggering, right? And you say to yourself, where's God? Like, how could this happen? So you need a Choni to remind you there's love there, even if right now it's a very difficult time. Okay, we're so far so good? Somebody good, thank you. Anyone's you're welcome to break in anytime. I don't want to, I'm used to teaching Nishmat. I don't get 3 lines out of my mouth before someone interrupts me. And argues. I'm teaching Israeli, so they just jump in freely and take over the class any moment. So I feel like I'm doing something wrong if no one interrupts me. So I'll keep going because Julie's there, but please feel free. Okay, so Julie, you want to go down to the next source? I'm going to number 5. Okay, so now we're ending. This is the last. How are we for time? Perfect. So we're now entering into the third phase. I just want to review. We had the Rav Huna Shimon ben Shetach response, which is the response of policy. We have the Choni response, and there are many characters like Choni in the Talmud. Characters who just realize that people need to be hugged, they need to be loved, they need mercy, they need to get things that they don't deserve. They need to feel that God loves them even when they don't deserve it. And they often come into tremendous conflict with the policymakers. And the Talmud seems to think that that's healthy. That's just the way it should be. Okay, you need both of those personalities because otherwise we dry up. But there's a third type of tzaddik, of holy person, in the third parak of the Masechet Tani. And in some ways, I find them personally the most intriguing. And the Talmud goes out of its way to highlight how complex these people are and how complex the picture is. So we're going to look at source number 5 and 6 and 7 in order. So we'll just do it slowly. Julie, I'll tell you when to scroll down. So this is a really wild story. This is right in the heart of the third parak of Tani. We go to Abaye and Rava. Now, Abaye and Rava are friends, and they're the two great scholars, fourth generation Amoraim in Babylon. I think we're talking 4th century, and they are the great scholars of their time. There's nobody even close. They run everything. They run the yeshivas. They're fundamental in any Talmudic discussion. You'll find Abaye and Rava. They really formed the legal language of the Talmud more than probably just about anybody else. And then the Talmud, in the middle of this whole discussion about times of crisis, tells this crazy story. There was a guy in the town of Abaye whose name was Abba. That's his name, Abba. And he was a bloodletter. Now you have to understand, bloodletter, the reason I chose the story is because it's sort of like a doctor. And I felt like in times like this, when doctors are sacrificing so much to take care of all of us, and we're all sort of helpless a little bit in face of what's coming, and the doctors are there on the front lines taking the hit and taking care of us. I felt a little bit of kavod. In the ancient world, the bloodletters were the doctors. The problem is that it's a very complicated business, letting blood. There's a lot of, it smells bad, it's violent, and it's a sketchy job because who knows what's going, it's difficult. And the point here is very powerful. The point here is that the bloodletter, when people are desperate, when they're sick, and this is true today as it was back then, we know this is true. I know that in Iran, a lot of people who were very sick with corona drank all sorts of things that they weren't allowed to drink and died as a result. I think something like 700 people died on overdosing on different kinds of poisons they drank because they thought it would help. When people are desperate, they're desperate. And when you go to a doctor and you're desperate, the doctor can take advantage of you in many ways. Okay, they take advantage of you by not respecting you physically, by just being rude and telling you undress. And if the doctor's a man and the patient's a woman, and being crass with your body is it's a profoundly unsettling, upsetting experience. I have many women in my family who've told me of different, whether it's my wife, my kids, going to a doctor who just has no sense of respect or their dignity and their tznius and their privacy. The doctor also can, gouge you for money because you need it. So Abba Umna is a doctor, and he deals with people in times when they need him the most. But he's not a privileged part of society. Doctors were not wealthy at the time. He was just, there. And here the Gemara tells the following story. Abba, the bloodletter, would receive greetings, whatever that means. It's not clear to me. Maybe it was a spiritual sign. Maybe it was some sort of acknowledgement, a heavenly voice. It's not clear. From the yeshiva of heaven, which is a concept in Chazal. Every single day. Somehow people knew that Abba, the bloodletter, not a scholar, not a saint, not a rabbi, nothing, just a guy who lets blood, one of the lower edges of society generally. He said he would get some sort of a divine recognition every day. And Abaye, who was the greatest rabbi of his time, because of Rava, he would get that once a week. And Rava got it once a year on Erev Yom Kippur. So both Abaye and Rava, as you'll see as we go on, get very upset about this. Like, this is totally crazy. I'm the greatest scholar. I worked my whole life. I worked my way up. I'm leading the Jewish people, and I get a hello from God once a year, and he gets it every day. So Abaye didn't understand why Abba would receive greater, honor than he did. And they said to him, well, you can't do what he does, which is an interesting statement. You can't do what he does. And I wonder what the logic is. We're going to see the stories in a second. But part of me says, you can't do it because he's greater than you. In his way, he's a much bigger man than you are. He does things that you couldn't do. Now, okay, you're a rabbi. You were raised in that way. You're a tremendous rabbi. You're the greatest rabbi of your generation. But there are things that he does that you're not capable of doing. He has a strength of character that you don't have in a certain way. The other reading, and you'll tell me when we get there, the other possible reading is that you can't do what he does because it's not your job. And we're going to see in a second, but I was thinking, I had a neighbor who just passed away right before the corona, actually a very old man. And we've been here for 4 years in this house, and his wife died when we moved in, right around then. And he was in great shape then, and he was in his 80s, and once his wife died, he started falling apart. And it was a relatively steep decline. And first of all, when his wife died, he came to us for Sukkot, and we used to talk, and he had a great conversation, a brilliant, he taught Tanakh. He was perfect in his Hebrew, diction and grammar, and he would correct us all. It was fun. He was really sort of a character. And as he declined, so his kids would come and were very frustrated, and they weren't able to work with him, and they hired a caretaker, a very, very simple man, a Muslim man from I forget which country, and not from here. And he came, and he was just constantly with this older man, taking care with an amount of tenderness that was just mind-boggling. And I was thinking to myself, Bibi Netanyahu and Litzman, who run the health ministry, have to make responsible policy in terms of taking care of the elderly and taking care of the sick. And, I'm not I'm a pretty optimistic person. I think they did a very good job with Corona. I'm not making a political statement. I'm very happy with the way things are running. I think our healthcare system, with all of its problems, is running well. But there's no way that Bibi Netanyahu can take care of every grandfather who needs just a hand getting up in the morning and getting to the bathroom or washing his face when he's not able to do so. There's a type of chesed that is so powerful, but that the powerful can't do, meaning the great rabbis need to confront the fact that there's greatness among very, very, very regular people. And so I'm not sure which of the two sides is right. I think they're probably both true, but now I want to look at the story. And this is going to round off the bigger picture. So in addition to the policymakers, in addition to the great spiritual leaders who pray for us, there's also all of these small anonymous people who are taking care of other people, who are really making sure that we're okay. In this case, I thought it was particularly appropriate to choose a doctor. So if you want to go down, Julie, to source number 6, and see if we can get 7 up there, good. When Abba, the blood letter, I skipped a line, I cut the, when he would treat people, it's supposed to say, he would bring the men in separately for the women. And not because he's frum, but because he recognized that bloodletting is a very disempowering experience. You lie down, you have to take off parts of your clothing, and someone cuts you and then catches the blood, and then he goes to somebody else. And you're extremely exposed, and he felt that it would be violating the privacy of women if you brought them together with men to see them like that. So he was very careful about that. And more than that, he had a special garment, which again seems obvious to me, but I know people who go to the doctor's office and say this isn't at all obvious. He had a special garment where he would cover up a woman's body, and if he needed to cut her in a certain place on the arm or the leg, he would open up a tear in the garment so that she didn't feel that he was violating her space by looking at her in a way that would make her feel even more vulnerable, an extremely vulnerable situation, because she needed him. There's nothing she can do. She needs the blood, can't cut herself. And so he would make sure that she would dress in the garment, he would not see her exposed. And even more than that, it says in the Talmud, he had a little hidden place in an office outside of where he worked, where once you were finished getting the service of being taken care of, you would walk out and put the money in a little jar. But that jar was secret. No one could see what you put in. So everyone who paid him, nobody knew whether they were poor or wealthy. Okay? And I find that story just tremendous. I had a dentist in Jerusalem. Her name's Dr. Glassman. And I say his name because I'm just so impressed by the story. I remember once I went with the kids and we had a checkup and the whole bit. And I was waiting in line, or waiting in the waiting room, and a woman came out of the treatment room. And she went to the secretary and said, okay, I did this and this and this. And she said, okay, that secretary said, that'll be so many thousand shekels. It was a serious thing. It was a root canal, whatever it was. And the woman said, okay, great, that's good. I'm just going to go home and organize the finances if you don't mind putting me putting that down on my bill. And the woman said, just let me check with the doctor. And she called the doctor. He said, yes, of course, just put her on the bill. And she said, thank you very much, and walked out. And it occurred to me, and I realized that this was the case. I looked into it afterwards, that this is the way the woman worked. She didn't have any money to pay for the dentistry. And the doctor knew absolutely she had no money. But he would never say that the service was free. He would always just say, oh, absolutely, that's fine. You can just pay it when you're able. And we'll keep track of it, which was his way. He was such an extraordinarily gentle man. And it was his way of preserving her dignity so that no one in the office would know. I happen to know because I figured things out, but a way of preserving her dignity. I just thought that's a type of greatness that you don't see in a lot of people. The ability in a quiet way to take care of someone who's very vulnerable at that moment. And those are the stories they say about Abba Una. Okay? And what you see is that the Talmud is telling you that there is there, in addition to the policymakers, in addition to the spiritual leaders who remind us that it's going to be okay, that God is with us, that there's more to the physicality, that suffering, we can live through it, that God loves us even when things are difficult. It's not just that. We don't just need the religious leaders and the politicians, even though we need them. We also need individually to take care of one another in that kind of a way, where you walk around and you see what other people need, and you make that a priority, and you just look out for them. Even when there's absolutely no expectation you'll do that. People go to the doctor's office, they don't expect to be taken care of like that. But he's able to see that. He's able to see what people truly need and take care of them. Okay? Good, so far so good? We got it? So there's a line at the end that I thought was Rava was distressed that Abaye would receive greetings from heaven every Shabbat Eve, and he would only get it once a year. So he was also jealous. So it's interesting. So he asked about it. I don't know whom he asked, but he asked about it. And they said, listen, it's okay because your merit protects the city. I thought that's an incredible insight. Rava, who wasn't particular into charity, that wasn't his thing. Abaye actually says elsewhere in the Talmud, in Masechet Rosh Hashanah, gave a lot of charity. Rava didn't. He was a great scholar and a great policymaker and a great rabbinic figure. He didn't do a lot of personal charity. And so the Talmud says, look, Rava, you protect the whole city because you're such a great leader. But you don't have an individual relationship with the people that you're ruling. And that's fine because you're doing your job well. But God senses that, and God responds where you give him space to respond. And the individual relationship that Abaye has with the people to whom he gives charity, and even more so that Abba Umna has with all of these people that he takes care of, they generate a response from God. So when you open yourself up to that side of God in yourself, when you take care of people in that form of individual chesed, then God also sees that in you and responds in kind. So that's an incredible observation that sometimes the greatest rabbi who really, really is doing the right thing, sometimes is distant from God in a certain way. Doing the right thing, it's not a criticism, but it's a recognition of the limits. Whereas someone who's not a big rabbi, not a big spiritual superstar, not fasting and praying all day, not learning the Talmud by heart, but actually getting out in the street and taking care of individuals, can have an extremely profound and personal relationship with God that the whole picture also hangs on. And you get this map that all three of these forces are necessary. Okay, Julie, I have time for one more story? We're good? Okay. So the last story, number 7, this is kind of my favorite of the whole. This is something, if we had more time, I'd be happy to talk about another time, because it touches on one of the sort of deeper secrets, I think, of rabbinic thought, and in particular Hasidic thought, which is something that I spent a lot of time thinking about. This is part of the same context. It's immediately following, page 22a. And the story here is about a rabbi named Rabbi Brucker, okay? And he would be found, his name is Brucker Choza, and he was found in the market of a place called Bei Lefet. And a bit of a discussion about where Bei Lefet is historically. And again, this is a reference to a phenomenon that occurs in the Talmud periodically, which is that certain people of a particularly high spiritual sensitivity were able to communicate with Elijah. So I could go on about that for a long time, because Elijah represents the bridge between a world of truth that's beyond us, a world of the God's perspective on the world, and a human world. That's because Elijah never died in the Tanakh. He sort of gets swept up to heaven without dying, and somehow he maintained some of his humanity and maintained some of his sort of immortality. And he's sort of a very exceptional character in the Tanakh, maybe the only one. So he manages to continue to communicate to people. We, of course, know Elijah comes to every bris and to Leila Seder, and that's a part of this whole system. So Elijah sees things that the rest of us don't. And one day, Rabbi Brucker says to him, is there anybody in this marketplace? You might have heard this story before. It's a famous story. It's one that I really love. Is there anyone in this marketplace? You have to imagine a bustling market like Machane Yehuda, if you know Jerusalem. One of my favorite places in the whole world. I try to go every day when I can, just to pick up something. I just love the energy and the shouting and the smells and the food. And that's where I do all my shopping as a chef. He's walking through this bustling place, and you've got, people asking for money here, and people shouting about how cheap their cucumbers are, and you've got somebody sort of tussling and arguing over prices on the side. Is there anyone here? And there's rabbis, asking for charity for people, and there's people giving blessings, people blowing shofars. You know the shuk if you've been there. Is anyone here who's really going to the world to come? Meaning someone who's grounded, so deeply grounded in their relationship to God that they're guaranteed to go to the world to come. Now, most of us are not guaranteed. We think, we hope, we work on it, but is anyone here for sure? And Elijah says there's no one. That's how the story starts. Story goes on and he meets somebody, and it's also a great story. We don't have time for it. But then he gets to the following. If you, Julie, don't mind scrolling down just a few more lines. At that moment, there were two brothers came into the marketplace. And Elijah said to Rabbi Broca, he said, these two men are going to the world to come. Okay? So Rabbi Broca looks at them, they look very simple, very, unremarkable. Looks at them, he says, I have no idea what he's talking about. They don't look, not spiritual greatness. He doesn't notice. They're rabbinic. He's never seen them before, never heard of them before. They don't have a name, no reputation. They're not great leaders of their people. They're not great, people who give great sermons or pray for everybody. He says, well, why? What do they have to do with the world to come? He's confused. So he goes to them and says, what do you do? And they say, we're clowns. That's what we do. We're jesters. And we walk through the shuk. And if you ever walk through a shuk, at least the one in Jerusalem, you know what he's talking about. I assume that the shuk in other places in the world is less, out of the Middle East, is less confrontational than the one here. But there are people, I've seen fist fights in the shuk on a regular basis. And I see people are struggling, financially. There's a lot of people, a lot of sad people in the shuk. And he says, I walk through, and when I see people who are sad, we joke around for them and make them happy. Okay? And when we see the people are fighting, which happens often, we make peace between them. Yeah, clowns, we joke around, make people laugh, and then we find a way to work it out. And that's the end of the story. And you're left with this sort of punch in the gut that after all of this talk of Choni and Shimon ben Shetach and Rav Huna, and Rabbah and Abaye, without whom we couldn't survive as the Jewish people, and we need those people. And not only that, and any people needs its own policymakers and leaders to make the right decisions. But at the end of the day, these people who are looking out for one another, seeing what that person needs, in particular laughter, making people happy again, making them able to see that behind the difficult, dark world that they live in, there's joy and there's fun and there's beauty, and that there's peace behind it. He stole from me, he took from me. Anyone who has kids knows how that can go on endlessly. He took mine, it was my turn. Recognize, let people laugh and see beyond that is to transcend the difficult, dark times you're in. And that ability, says Eliyahu, is connected to the world to come. Okay? So that wraps up the story. That wraps up the three characters I wanted to introduce you to, Rav Huna and Abu Umna, and Choni and Abu Umna. I wanted to say two things about the end. There's something about that end story that we could spend more time on. It's something I've thought about a lot in context of a lot of Hasidic teachings about laughter, about the power of laughter in redeeming us. It's something that I do think about, someone who appreciates humor also. And just what it means to be able to laugh, why it's such a profound, life-changing experience or situational changing experience. When everything looks bleak and someone makes you laugh, it doesn't change anything. It just changes how you relate to the world around you, and just why that's such a profound thing. There's a lot of, I think, very profound insight. If you ever want a class on laughter and Talmud and Hasidic, I'm happy to do that. But to go back to the simple message, I think, of the whole story, you've got three characters. And I've been wondering, again, I don't have any explanation for these things. I'm not a policymaker, nor am I a big tzaddik, nor am I the funniest guy in the world. But I've been looking around and I'm noticing that Israel seems right now, bli ayin hara, God willing, with God's help, to have done okay with the coronavirus. And there have been a ton of mess ups. I don't know if any of you are in Israel right now, or you've been following, but there's been lots of bungled messages and bad rollouts and mistakes. And today they opened up the schools. No schools had any idea what they're supposed to be doing. It's total chaos. But at the same time, I feel a tremendous amount of trust in the government. And that's not a political statement. It has nothing to do with which person. I just feel that as a group, as much as they seem incompetent sometimes, from the top to the bottom, they've done a really powerfully good job. And I think that some of that has to do with this. I think when I listen to the Prime Minister and the Health Minister talking about it, I feel that they have a very healthy sense of the balance between, we have to look out for the whole country. There has to be a policy. The economy has to go back. But there's always this sense of every individual in this story matters. And we're going to have to find a balance, and there are going to be compromises that are difficult. There's no way around that. But a sense of taking responsibility for the policy. I feel that a little bit in Israel. I feel a lot, actually. And then you have the spiritual leaders, which I happen to need. I look around and there's a lot of chaos, and I read about places in the world where it's overwhelming. In Israel, it's not overwhelming. It's scary, but it's not overwhelming. But I read about places in particular, reading about in Africa and India, where people are really starving to death as a result. And I hear stories about other places in the world, in New York, communities that I know, where there's a tremendous amount of suffering. And it's so powerful for me as an observer in this case, but for all of us who are in that, to have people who remind us that God loves us, God's with us, God cares. And as bewildering and mysterious as it is, it's not an abandonment. It's just part of a very complicated relationship, but that God loves us in that. The person who can remind me of that is a person that I need in my life, because it's easy to despair. It's too easy to despair. And then I think of all the people, and that's why I went to Abu Umna, the doctor, who are out on the street, filling up, in the hospitals, who are, we have a nurse as a neighbor, who are just going out night after night, risking themselves in a very serious way, putting in hours that are crazy, not always getting, compensated, and doing it out of a sense that I've got to take care of my patients. And I just feel like when that system is working together, the political, the spiritual leadership, and just the ability of every single individual person to do that chesed for the one person next to them without thinking about the bigger picture, then that's a society that's healthy and functioning. That's something I don't always feel in Israel, but right now I'm feeling in a very strong way, and it's not the first time. And something that I think is a Jewish world, a Jewish community, that's something that we really have to, I think we need that. We need it. The corona is not the only crisis we're going through now. This, better than I do this. There's surges of all sorts of attitudes toward Jews in the world that are very scary. Obviously, there's, the assimilation is something that's terrifying. And there's the military situation. The Jewish world is facing constant trouble. And it seems to me that these three things, the spiritual confidence that God is with us and there's Hashem and He cares, the political leadership that can make the tough decisions because of the bigger picture, and in their own way, I wouldn't say most of all, but in some ways most of all, just that tremendous chesed that's not thinking, that's just given. I think that's what's going to keep us going. And it's a bigger part of, what we're going through now, and I think as a people overall. So I hope that was interesting.
Can I speak up?
A minute before 6, Julie, how am I? That was good, right? I didn't go over the hour. She said, keep it to an hour. So I went for 59 minutes, I've got to say. So yeah, if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to.
Can I just second that? I'm also living in Israel. And I also find that the sense of solidarity and unity among Am Yisrael, of really people of all different backgrounds, has been truly inspirational. And there is a sense of spirituality, I feel really among everybody sees this as, everybody that I've been in touch with sees this in some way as Yad Hashem, religious and non-religious. And I think that is also helping with a sense of unity, that we're all in this together, and we're all going to overcome this together. And that does contribute to that sense of that we want to be engaged in the chesed to help, because we're part of the solution.
Yeah, and I think that last point was Ilana spoke?
Yes.
I think that's very powerful, because I think there's an idea that goes very, very deep in Jewish sources, that God has the bigger picture, but works through us in such a powerful way. And just that sense that other people are sacrificing for us, and each of us is taking care of each other. We each do our job, and then you have the bigger people who are taking care of the bigger picture is really powerful. So thank you very much, everybody. As I told Julie, I give a series of classes. This is what I do at Nishmat, if you're ever curious about what Nishmat does. It's teach classes where the Talmud sort of opens up questions that then are sort of hit you in a very personal way, because they deal with the same issues, again, in a different language. We're in a postmodern world. 21st century is not, 5th century Babylon. The issues are different, but the ultimate Jewish and human issues are universal. And the ability to translate from one to the other, I just think is such a magical gift that we have as a people. We have these sources. It's so meaningful to go into them. So I told you I'd be happy to do another class sometime if you ever want.
Okay, Rav Yehoshua?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Adina Fredman. I'm in New York.
Hey. I can't see you, but I can recognize your voice.
I'll turn on my, I'm not working. But I just wanted to thank you. I mean, these are stories that I've read and I've known, but the way you pulled them together was so meaningful, and I'm so glad that I made the opportunity to listen to you. And really, I feel like I can look at, things are very crazy here, and it's making me feel more positive about moving forward. So thank you so much.
Well, it's really great to see you.
And you should have much chizuk from it.
It gives me chizuk, this stuff, because it really also reminds me that it's we're all in this. Meaning we all have, I'm not a doctor. There's very little I can do. I'm not a big spiritual leader. I'm certainly not a politician. Thank God. And there's a lot of there are very few things that I can do. I mean, I got my kids at home. But if I realize that there's a system and we're all part of it, not everyone is perfect, but we're all doing our bit, I do think that gives hope. I really do. So.
Thank you.
You help make a lot of sense out of chaos.
What's that?
You help make sense out of what sometimes feels like chaos.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I was very moved by was that I felt that you gave a framework where each of us can find a place for ourselves.
I do think that's true also, very much.
Yeah. It really was very helpful and very moving, actually.
Is this share going to be recorded?
Yes.
It was recorded.
Okay, wonderful. Then I can pass it on. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay.
It's nice to see familiar faces. I won't mention everybody, but it's nice to see you.
Thank you, Rav Yehoshua, and to everyone listening. We are back on next Sunday. We have a slight schedule change. It'll be Rav Avi Blitzstein, who is the head of Nishmat's continuing program for 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th year students. He's wonderful, and I invite you to join us again next week. Everyone have a wonderful week. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Yeah. Bye.